Okay, I had another video topic to do, and I thought this would be really fun to do. Um, this video this is a beekeeping video, and it's a beekeeping topic. When you study honeybees, one of the first things you get into is what kinds there are and what are they like? What do they look like? And you want to find out everything you can. They're so interesting. Honeybees absolutely are one of the most unique and wonderful things that God has created. And I'm very thankful to be able to have learned about them and been a beekeeper. And I still like doing bees. So when you learn about bees, a lot of people who are beekeepers, they'll tell you it's almost spiritual when they're out in their bee yard in their apiaries, and they feel like their connection to God really increases. And sometimes that's the place where they pray, is in their bee apiaries. That's very interesting, isn't it? Now, um, it's okay that if it's just, if you want to stick to the logic, we're going to deal with mostly just logic here. So you don't need to be afraid of that if that's something you're worried about. Anyway, when you start learning about honeybees, one of the first things you learn is that European honeybees really are where the good honey production is. And most of the world has been using European genetic honeybees for honey production and beekeeping. There are a couple of exceptions to this. For example, there are Asian honeybees. Some of those are pretty good. They're not as good on the honey production as European honeybees, but they have some disease resistances that European honeybees don't. Anyway, but for purposes of this video, I'm just going to briefly touch on, if you're listening to this, chances are you're already interested and have learned a few things about beekeeping. So you already know that mostly what the world uses now is Italian honeybees and Carniolan honeybees. What you might not know is that before people started using Italian honeybees and Carniolan honeybees, Europeans tended to use the German black bees. They called them a German black bee. It was the scientific name Apis Mellifera Mellifera. So basically this was the German black bees, is what everyone called them. But it doesn't mean they were German, because you'd find this same variety of AMM, or Apis Mellifera Mellifera. You'd find them in the British Isles. You'd find them in Northern Europe. You find them in Spain even. And they were interesting. Mostly this kind of bee was used during the Skep beehive era, which was before Langstroth came along. Langstroth was the one that came along with the box beehive design. So first, the physical characteristics of the European dark bee, or AMM. The coloration of German black bees tended to be dark or black more than the other honeybee subspecies. It basically looked very, very black or dark. They were fairly comparable in the size compared to what we have now for European bees. They were considered harder to work with, though, because they were more defensive and usually a little bit more ornery. Many people consider the defensiveness to be a disadvantage, but it did help them to fend off predators. Uh, German black bees, or the European dark bees, had a higher tendency to swarm than other subspecies. They also had smaller nests and smaller colonies. That's a major factor, because if you have a smaller colony, it's harder to work with, and especially when you're trying to get winter over, when you're trying to get them to survive winter, you want a larger nest. And this is part of one of the reasons why you can see how they would have been phased out when the Langstroth hive colony box system was introduced. The German black bees, or Apis mellifera mellifera, was considered highly adaptable in some ways because it was well adapted to colder climates and harsh winters. It did very well in those kinds of areas. If the climate was not ideal, they'd still be able to do fairly well. The honey production was good with these kind of bees. It wasn't as good as Italians on the honey production, but it was still pretty good. The brood rearing cycle for these kind of bees was supposedly a little bit slower than Italians. I didn't find any research comparing them to Carniolans. They're not Carniolans. So now one of the main problems with the German black bees was that they had poor disease resistance. That's one of the things you read about. When you study about them, people will say one of the reasons they were phased out was that they were just naturally having a hard time with bee diseases at the time period. They were just sort of naturally going out on their own. They were supposedly particularly vulnerable to foul brood, American foul brood specifically. So as American foul brood emerged, the black bees, or European dark bees, they started losing against it, and at the same time, Italian honeybees were being brought in. Anyway, that decreased their popularity and usage. There are some places that are trying to bring back black bees, and that's kind of interesting. Now, one of the main and one of the most interesting things about this particular type of honeybee was that it could fly in colder temperatures than other honeybees. This is why they say it was well adapted to the cold areas. So it could fly an estimated 1 to 3 degrees Celsius lower than Italian and Carniolan bees. Now, I want to be careful about not stating actual temperatures, because I've seen more than one set of data on this, and the data on flying temperatures doesn't all agree with each other. For example, traditionally today people quote honeybees as being able to fly down to about 48 degrees Fahrenheit. But some of the data showed for Italian and Carniolans now said that they could fly down to 45. I'm not sure I would stretch that. The German black bees could fly basically 1 to 3 degrees Celsius, which is actually about 2 to 4 degrees Fahrenheit lower than these other two, basically. I've only seen bees fly as low as about 48 degrees. I haven't made a big effort in really pushing the numbers on that, though. Bees don't like to fly that low, and where I'm at, it's high altitude, and when it's that cold, there's nothing for them to forage anyway, so you won't really see that. But in Europe, it's a little bit different. Now, the main idea of why bees can fly when it's cold, it's directly related to their bee fat, the body fat in the bee. The chemical in the bee that is used to produce and store that fat is called vitellogenin. Vitellogenin is also the key marker on why Africanized bees can only go so far north. So it makes perfect sense that vitellogenin would also be the factor of why Apis Mellifera mellifera would be able to go further north than these other bees. An estimate I've heard for a hypothesis and a theory of why AMM bees could, fly in the colder was an estimate that their vitellogenin levels could be anywhere from 10% to 30% higher than these other bees. That is an unproven estimate, however, but it kind of makes sense. That's all the information I have on AMM bees at this time. There are some places in Europe that are trying to bring back this kind of line, mostly for novelty, I guess. And there's even some areas that claim to have some. You can find a few videos on them, but it's hard to say. If they look dark and are black, and if they could match all these traits, it could really be that them. But the main problem is they're not as well suited for disease resistance, and they weren't as gentle to work with. So they're not really going to come back, although they are fascinating to learn about. That's all for now.